I just went live on my end as a heads up. So,
Let's do it live.
Yeah, we're not having a private conversation
Do you ever have private conversations?
on the internet. Not as often as I'd like. I'm a big believer in the idea that
Podcast
part of our
client
problem.
privilege.
Well, yeah, and also I don't think like you can really solve a problem when you're talking publicly. Like if you got to take into account everyone in the world hyper analyzing what you say,
Yeah.
it's hard to really get into the meat of things. I think sometimes if you got to solve a problem, you got to talk to somebody, person to person.
This sounds like you're laying the groundwork for oligarchy. Dark, smoky rooms. All problems need to be solved in private.
Yeah, maybe. I don't think so though. I think it's more, like if you imagine like back in the day before the internet, like our old politics, it's like, yeah, they had to go out and make the speech and they had to sell it to the people. And there was that aspect, but they could also go in the smoky back room and say, politics aside, how do we solve the problem? Right. And now there's no smoky back room. There's only the speech. And if everything you say is hyper analyzed for public consumption, I think our politicians can't drop kayfabe. I think they're in WWE mode all the time, playing to their base.
All right. Yeah. I don't know. You say that, but maybe you're just not privy to the dark, smoky rooms, right?
Yeah, it's possible.
It's called Black Rock for a reason, right?
I had this crazy experience once where this is a little bit of a tangent, so sorry, but I was asked by a client to try to figure out ways to make the European Union more transparent. They wanted to get cameras and microphones into these hearings about the Roma and what the European Union was going to do about the Roma, and because they were Roma rights advocates. They thought that if they had cameras in there, it would be better, right?
Okay,
because you could hear like which nations were being racist and who was doing X terrible thing.
It's just like police body cams, right? As long as we have the footage, it'll all sort itself out.
So then I started talking to lawyers who do on-the-ground representation for the Roma in Europe, like they're actual lawyers, right? And their universal response was, please, God, don't do that. Please,
Why
God,
not?
don't do that. It'll ruin everything. Because A, it's going to out everybody who's doing anything to advocate for these people, which will expose them. It's basically like it's going to mass dox all the people involved. But then B, more pressingly, at the time, Italy was like very, very saying a lot of racist stuff about the Roma in their politics. And they were actually concerned that Italy couldn't take a step back politically and and come to an agreement behind closed doors if they had to have their statements recorded publicly. So just as a matter of policy, they thought it wasn't, they thought the transparency was going to cut against them, which is the first time I ever thought about that idea. But anyway, it was an interesting moment.
Yeah, no. Do you know much about the Roma? These are gypsies, right? We're not supposed to call them that, though, right?
Yeah, you're supposed to say the Roma, but yeah, the Roma are stateless, largely stateless individuals, with gypsies, as you'd say, with a specific heritage in Europe, and it's been a long-standing issue. Kind of how like in every culture, there's certain people that you're not allowed to be prejudiced against and certain people you are allowed to be prejudiced against. In Europe, it's always been the Roma, right? So it's like, like in America,
they're allowed.
If you're living in the Northeast, you can't, if you say something racist, like that's messed up. But if you say something about Southerners being stupid, they're going to let that slide, right? Yeah. Every culture has this, like these unspoken rules, and the Roma have had the short end of the stick forever because they're stateless. So in every culture, they're the culture that you're allowed to target. So
are you an advocate or are you advocacy adjacent?
For this issue or in general?
Any issue, any public policy issue, sociological issue?
I mean, I'm a commercial litigator. So in terms of my day job, when I do law, I'm doing it for private parties for private interests, right?
Smoky rooms.
Yeah. In terms of my public facing comments, I do this not like for money. I certainly don't get any money out of it, or very little. Yeah, I do it because I think that there's a unique American philosophy that ties into our law, but is not exclusive to our law, that's being lost. And, a lot of the times when people talk about like liberalism or the flaws of liberalism, they're not even talking about liberalism, because the core metaphysic and meta ethic that made American liberalism what it is isn't being taught anymore. And I'm trying to bring that back. I'm trying to, in my small way, resuscitate what I would call the American philosophy.
Well, so there's this ongoing debate about a propositional nation, whether or not America is a propositional nation. But it's undeniable that America's founding is lawyerly, stacked to the nines with lawyers, right? So the philosophy, the ontology, the teleology of law is baked into whatever this experiment is. I don't even like this nation, I guess. So if we follow your track and say, well, what are the founding principles of this thing we call liberalism? What is the founding principles of this American nation? You're going to have to wrestle with the philosophy of law. So could you help me understand the core principles of law, especially the American branch?
Yeah, I actually think people get this wrong a lot. Like, you hear people argue about, is America a propositional nation? But then even the advocates of the propositional nation misstate the proposition. So, like, we have two founding documents, right? We have the Constitution, which is a legal document. It's positive law. This is the rules of the road. This is the structure of the government, right?
Okay.
And then we have the Declaration of Independence, and that's a moral document. It says, why ought we be a nation? What is it about America that justifies its existence morally? And if you're looking for the American moral proposition, that's where you should look. And I think they said it very clearly. We find these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that to safeguard those rights, governments are instituted among men. So what they're referencing is a philosophic belief called natural law, that there are objective moral principles that are not cultural constructs. It's not something that we invented. It's objective and discoverable. They would have said, endowed upon us by our Creator. And the purpose of a just government is to secure those natural rights. So what they did is they took what someone like Helen Pluckrose or James Lindsay would refer to as classic liberalism, and they gave it a grounding metaphysic, where they said, like, not only is this a moral claim, we're saying it is actually true, and that's why we get to be a country. But we don't teach this to our kids anymore. It's it's an afterthought. No one talks about it. But if you understand that, everything else about America makes more sense. And if you don't understand that, nothing about America makes sense.
There are questions or criticisms of this objective statement of moral truth. Several. One is the ethnic reality. This document was founded by certain people with a certain historical background, with certain ties to, let's say, Europe, specifically the Anglosphere. I mean, they're an extension of the Anglosphere. There's a reason why the Constitution made sense for those people at that time. And the language about objectivity, though the postmodernists have gone too far with this line of inquiry or criticism, is still a subjective projection of truth. Right? And you can see that this is a tired trope, but it's true that, is it Liberia? Took the same document and gave it to another people, and it didn't work at all for them. So there is some sort of subjective, culturally grounded reality going on in our document. And so not only have we lost what you say is the argument, but we're so far distant from those people. I mean, we're still related to them. A portion of us are, a rapidly diminishing proportion of us are.
A few responses. The first is, I think the ethnicity point is overdone in these discussions, because if you look at the declarations of independence of other nations didn't do what we did. Like, I looked at the Declaration of Independence from Ireland, because they also got free of England, right? And they didn't say, we found these principles of natural law that we're founding our nation on, and here's our philosophic justification. They said exactly what you'd expect them to say. We, the Irish, are a separate people, and the English have been oppressing us, therefore we deserve freedom, right? They said exactly what you would expect an ethnic basis for a nation would sound like. But that's not what our founders did. They did something else. They said that we have a philosophic justification for this nation, regardless of whatever any other nation does. Mm-hmm. And then, with the question about objectivity versus subjectivity, in philosophy, there's often this confusion about epistemology versus ontology. Like I don't think anyone serious about philosophy would make the claim that we have perfect knowledge of what is moral or what is good. Like obviously we don't. We're flawed. Different people have different cultural reference points.
Yes.
That's all clear.
Yeah.
But their claim was that there is such a thing as an objective standard. There is such a thing as natural law, right? Like when you say, and because these were mostly religious men or Christians and like me deists who would say something along the lines of, natural law represents our divine nature. It's our connection to God. That would be probably how they say it. There's other ways you can do it as an atheist, but as a non-atheist, they'd say something like that. So then when they say, well, is free speech good or bad, or is it relative? No, they're not saying it's relative. They're saying that these are amongst the values, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that are so core to what it means to be a human that some cultures get it better than others. There's no such thing as cultural relativity on these issues. There's actually a correct answer, and some cultures just are wrong. And that's the perspective they were taking. These were not cultural relativists. These were people who believed in moral realism. So I actually, from that perspective, find the rise of moral anti-realism and cultural relativism to actually be a direct threat to American classic liberalism, because American classic liberalism is just founded on the opposite principle.
But so some cultures are more human than others. Is that what you're saying? Some cultures get it right.
They're just more right than others. Doesn't mean they're more human than others. It means they're better at it than others. Like, I think cultural relativism, to believe that fully, you have to assume that there's no objective standard. It's all up to us. It's all subjective, right? Because otherwise you would say, well, if free speech is better than not free speech, then cultures that have free speech are, at least in that aspect, doing a better job, right?
Yeah, but free speech isn't a universal principle. Different cultures have different tacks and different constraints on speech. And we have constraints on speech too. We don't have utter free speech. Of course, we have that legalistic, calls to violence and defamation. I mean, you can get punished for your speech socially and legally and so on and so forth. But different cultures or different peoples, in order to be ruled and ordered, have different allowances for speech, and particularly what speech counts as acceptable and what's not acceptable. Right. And
can I give you an example from Sam Harris to just point this out?
Oh, yeah. Let's go, Sam.
I love this example that he gave once about
Sam
the absurdity of, cultural relativism when it comes to moral questions.
Yeah.
Let's say that there was a culture and they had a religion, and their religion said the third son shall be blind. It was part of their prophecy. So as part of their religious observances, they just cut the eyes out of every third kid. Like, they just line them up. They count to three, third kid loses their eyes, right? Yeah. So the third kid's blind. And the question is, can you say that that's actually wrong? Can you say that's not like, can you say it's wrong according to the standards of my culture, but can you say that's actually wrong? And I think certainly our founders would have said, yeah, no problem. That is actually wrong. There is an actual objective standard for at least some aspects of human behavior, maybe not everything, but some aspects. Yeah. And we can attempt through reason, through philosophy, through religion, if that's how you roll, to determine what that standard is. And once we do determine what that standard is, we can judge accordingly. So on the flip side, if you're a moral anti-realist or a radical subjectivist or postmodern type, you're locked into this view where, well, how could I ever say it's wrong to cut out the eyes of a child? Because that's what they believe culturally, which is candidly an absurd position. Like,
what I'm trying to thread, I'm not arguing for anti-realism or moral relativism. I'm just at a place in my understanding of things, faulty and shallow though it be, that there's not just either universalism or relativism. There are culturally distinct groups made up of people with lineages that have different standards and different needs in order to be ordered. And so certain forms of freedom require certain forms of responsibility, which require certain barriers or bars of functionality, and certain people's behave differently. And you can look at, and this is, I'm not an ethno-nat or ethnocentrist or anything like that, but I'm trying to figure out how these ideas kind of poke at that universal liberal ideal that all men are created equal. They're not. And so certain peoples are going to behave certain ways. And you can see that by importing a whole bunch of Somalians into Minnesota. Their way of life, their culture is eroding the way of life of the Minnesotans, who are of Dutch, Nordic descent. They have different patterns of behavior, different competencies, and different moral frameworks by which they abide.
Yeah.
The Northwestern Europeans are much more individualistic, much more able to empathize with difference, and Somalians are much more nepotistic. And those ways of behaving and ordering society are going to rub against each other. And there's no necessarily universal principle. There's power. There's a rule of law that can either subject them all to a standard or not.
See, I think this is actually a great example of where the modern interpretation of liberalism has just completely failed us, and why I advocate for what I call like a non-pussy version of liberalism, right? Where it's grounded in this metaphysic, and the reason why that matters is it solves some of the obvious problems that you're pointing out, right? Because let's back up. The phrase "all men are created equal," of course, doesn't mean literally. I am not physically equal to LeBron James. There's just no universe where you could say that's true. It's obviously false that I am physically equal to LeBron James. They're saying of equal moral worth, right? Equal dignity is what they're basically saying.
Yeah.
And then, but if you take the metaphysics seriously, and you might not believe it, but like if you just take for a second,
I want to. It's in my blood. It's my culture.
Our founders do believe it. So they say, we think that we have discovered objective facts about the universe. It is morally good to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are not, it's like 2 + 2 = 4. It's like saying, P cannot be not P. Like these are the laws of logic, the laws of math, the laws of morality. And we've discovered these things. So then the question, when you say like, okay, we bring in a bunch of Somalis, and we've had a refugee program with Somalia for decades. And because it's a refugee program, there's a bit less vetting than you would have in most other situations.
Why are we morally obligated to be a resource for these refugees? Well, anyways, go on. I'm sorry. Total tangent.
How much are you willing to advocate for assimilation when you bring in people to your nation? Right? If you believe, as our founders did, that our moral standards are not just ours, but are actually objectively correct, then assimilation is the obvious thing to argue for, because in order to be an American, you need to accept the moral proposition. You need to accept our reverence for natural law, our reverence for classical liberalism, our reverence for the Constitution. These are the non-negotiables. And if you're not going to do that, you shouldn't be here. That's what we do in this country. Now, the problem is the kind of modern, softer liberalism says, well, it's all culturally relative. So how could we possibly require that of people who come here, multiculturalism, et cetera? And that, I think, is actually the problem, right? Because when you say...
Well, where does that problem begin? With the people who founded this nation swore on Bibles, right?
Yeah.
We don't do that.
I think
we burn Bibles.
I actually think that is a problem. Like, I think if you looked at the founders, and I'm a little bit biased because I am a deist, but they were a collection of Christians and deists, and they were faced with the problem of, look, the deists, they don't believe in the Bible, but they believe in God. The Christians have multiple denominations. We've got small pockets of Jews in the country, even at the founding. What is the unifying principle that unites all these people, right? Well, they believe in God. They believe in objective morality. They believe in natural law. And they found that unifying principle. And they didn't say because Jesus Christ gave us natural rights in the Declaration of Independence, because not everyone would have agreed with that. But they did say their creator did. They did say natural law because that was the common moral baseline for the people at the founding. Mm-hmm. I do think, I'm not saying atheism is always incompatible with that worldview. I know atheists who believe in objective morality, but I do think the modern culture of self-worship, where you say it's all relative, so my opinion is the thing that really matters because it's all relative. So what could be more important than me and my politics? I think that is antithetical to the American philosophy. You know, in the American philosophy, you are not the top of the value hierarchy. There's natural law above you, and you are aspiring to reach that type of justice. And that changes the way you view the world.
Yeah. That natural law, though, this is the problem with the language of liberalism. It dresses itself up in universal language and aesthetic, but it's not universalist. It's particularist. It's a very noble, kind of sanitized particularism, but it's still very particular. Now, I guess you could go back to Abrahamic law, but it doesn't seem like Islam's going to get along with Christian and back up.
What do you mean by particulars? Can you expand on that?
So, just on an aesthetic level, my beef. I am a liberal. I can't get away from that. I'm a post-liberal. I'm a hyper-liberal. I critique my. You brought up the Declaration of Independence. The first part of it is a screed about their king, right? It's a revolutionary, rebellious document against authority and trying to relocate authority in our hands. And they say, we find these truths to be self-evident. Now that language sounds like it's universalist. This is true for all people at all times. So therefore we can declare that our way of life is the best way of life for us.
And they actually did believe that. It's not that they were just putting on the aesthetic. If you look at the prevailing philosophy of the time was called what's Scottish common sense moral realism.
Yes.
And what that philosophy posited, it was a direct reaction to the philosophy.
I love
of David Hume.
the little ethnic signifier in there, Scottish,
yeah. Because David Hume, who's famously not, he had his own school of thought. He injected radical doubt into philosophy, where he kind of was asking, like, can we even really know that cause and effect is real? Yeah. We have no real way of actually interacting with the world. And the Scottish common sense moral realists said, no, we reject all of that. Any philosophy that doesn't start with things that are just common sense and obvious is not worth taking seriously. And they posited, look, there is an external world. We interact with it. This is obvious. My senses can be trusted. This is obvious. God's moral law is written on my heart, and I can tell what's right and what's wrong. And this is obvious. And there's no reason to doubt it. So when they say these truths are self-evident, what they mean is they're axiomatic. We take it as a moral axiom that natural law exists and that a government is just because it honors natural law and unjust if it fails to. And so for them, I don't think this is a tough question. Like you say, like, oh, well, there's a culture in the Middle East that really, really loves, female circumcision and really loves oppressing its people. And there's no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of religion, all these things. What do you think of this culture? They're like, that. They'd say, that's awful. It's worse than what we're doing. Now, could you make the argument maybe those people couldn't be exposed to our version of democracy instantly because there's too much cultural friction? Yeah, I guess so. But they're not saying that. They're saying there's an objective moral standard. And if I weigh that culture against ours, it's not close. Ours is better. Yeah. And they would be comfortable with that because there is an objective standard. And if there's an objective standard, it follows that you could be closer or further to meeting it, right? Yeah. Like there's right and wrong.
Well, that's all fine and dandy when the United States is founded, but sometime in the 20th century, the United States became the governing unipolar order. Now we had a tug of war with Russia, but Russia eventually collapsed. And this whole notion, the George W. Bush notion of exporting democracy, which was already embedded in the liberal world order, this rules-based order that we were obeying and abiding by up until other power centers are now eroding it, and our own inflationary principles, our own deleterious loss of morality, compass, work ethic, et cetera, et cetera. It's fine when people say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and so we are going to abide by these rules. If anybody wants to get on board with us, you have to abide by these rules. But once we start to control the world, then we have a moral obligation to export those moral principles. And I mean, for some reason, it eventually just became capitalism. It became resource extraction and trade, and then capitalism only kind of functions. It probably doesn't, but it requires a moral foundation. I know that Adam Smith, who penned the book on capitalism, from my perspective of him, his central work for him was his moral foundation, not his capitalist foundation. And his whole capitalism thing didn't work without that moral framework, that way of trading, that way of seeing other people, that way of saying we have moral worth here, so let's set aside our swords and let's exchange goods. So the language of universal liberalism, of classical liberalism, it's dressed up in, and you go to Washington, you see all these monuments that are aesthetically rhyming with Roman architecture and Greek architecture. But if we know now through archaeology that the sculptures that we see now were painted. They had a lot of cultural particularism. They were probably gaudy from our standpoint, but we've taken everything, that the bones of that, and stripped it of its color, and then made that our color. We've made those universal principles our color, and it blinds us to the fact that other people. This is where we get to assimilation. How do we export those values to other people? How do we import those people and instill those values? And then we have to impose speech through that. We have to indoctrinate. This is where liberalism eventually ends up. We're just going to educate people to our way of seeing.
I think that you raised a couple interesting points, and I'm going to try to work through them. Maybe
and thank you. I'm working through these. I'm importing ideas and criticisms that I haven't found sufficient answers to. I don't necessarily hold these criticisms to be self-evident, but I'm looking for classical liberals to stand up to these things.
So a few points that I think are really important that you zoomed in on. One is, I do think liberalism has what's called a replication problem. I'm sensitive to this.
Psychology does.
Well, exactly, because if you look at an ideology that's grounded in a religious text, the stricter the religious rules, the more closely the next generation follows them. Right? Like if you're in a fanatical sect of Islam and you'll literally be executed for deviating from the rules copy more easily. It also means that there's no flexibility, which is another downside. But
so it's not a replication, it's a mutation crisis.
Yeah, or controlling mutation, you could put it that way.
Yeah.
Where, when you look at Orthodoxy or Catholicism, they have less mutation than Protestants do because they have tighter control over the doctrine, right?
Yes.
Liberalism, classic liberalism, or true liberalism, as I would refer to it, in terms of the founding idea, has a massive mutation problem. And it has a massive mutation
because it doesn't see itself as a doctrine. It doesn't see itself as a religion, but it is a religion.
Because it's unmoored in a lot of people's minds from natural law. Now, if you say classic liberalism is in fact the correct ideology because we believe natural law is true, this armors you against mutation to a certain extent, because you have a grounding metaphysic. Now you have a reason to say, no, I'm actually right. It's not just a question of opinion. And I had an argument with Helen Pluckrose about this because she's
wonderful to argue with.
She's wonderful to argue with, but she believes in kind of the British version of classic liberalism, which has no grounding metaphysic. It's just a preference. We prefer to have liberalism.
And where's the UK headed now?
Well, exactly. I think without the armor of a grounding metaphysics, you can look at the UK and say, well, this is going to go badly, because as you import more and more people who, if as they acquire the right to vote, are going to choose with their children or their descendants to vote for Sharia law. And Sharia law has a strong armor against mutation.
They're not
powerful.
Even before even voting for it. They just practice it.
Yeah. Well, liberalism without any philosophic mooring is very vulnerable to that type of assault, right? Like, we're going to show up, we're going to take advantage of liberalism, we're going to vote for something that's totally contrary to liberalism, we're going to live contrary to these principles, and what are you going to do about it, liberal? Because liberalism has no defense mechanism. But of course, the defense mechanism is what our founders already had, which is like, no, what you're voting for, what you're trying to do is actually contrary to our understanding of natural law, and we don't have to tolerate it. We don't have to be infinitely permissive of things that are violating our moral center, and that infinite permissiveness is the hole in modern liberalism, and if that isn't fixed, the ideology goes down with the ship.
Well, how do you reestablish intolerance? Where do you start with that?
Well, I mean, it's a funny way of putting it. I do think you need to think about the education system. I'm a former teacher, so that's my bias. I was a teacher for 7 years before I became a lawyer. But I think that, like, I didn't learn about these founding philosophic principles until I was in my 30s in law school. This, I learned about all men are created equal as kind of a 1960s civil rights movement type of thing.
But how old are you? I mean, what decade did you come of age?
I'm 43, so okay. I was born in the 80s.
Millennial.
Raised in the 90s.
Geriatric millennial.
Yeah. But like this stuff wasn't taught. This stuff was like the idea.
It was assumed.
It's assumed that you would pick up on it somehow. But actually, I think we should be teaching like core civics and core American philosophy should absolutely be central to American education. Other than like reading, writing, math, like the basics, I would say that's probably the most important thing you can learn.
Moral education.
And also just like the basics, not just we have free speech, but why? Why do people care about having free speech? Not just freedom of religion or freedom or, the right to bear arms, but why? Why did our founders think this was so important? And not just the history of it, but if you ask them, if you ask them, what would they have said? And they would have said look, we just had this oppressive king. And how did he oppress people? He took the weapons away from the militia. He didn't disband the militia. He took the weapons away. And therefore, even when he violated our most core natural rights, the most core rights we hold dear, people were powerless against him. And we never want that to happen again. We believe that if these rights are infringed, you should be able to abolish your government as a just response. And the only way that's possible is if the people are armed. That's not the sort of thing that is explained to you in American school. It just isn't. But if you get older and you do the reading, that's what they thought. And I think that America makes a lot more sense from that perspective than it does from this kind of wishy-washy, oh yeah, we have a constitution and yeah, some of it's stupid, but we're stuck with it sort of vibe that people have today.
Okay, so to get back to ethnicity, it's in common sense realism, it's Scottish common sense realism. There's a flavor there that they admit to, and there's a you can feel that robust, that preacherly Carlylean strength of character. Like, this is common sense, and common is a communal thing. It's like language. I was listening to one of your talks about language and postmodernist or Fausch or some sort of internet beef that you were going over and stuff like that. Is it not true that a people or several people within a bandwidth of lineage, like an evolutionary heritage and a Christian heritage at that, so there's a religious aspect to it and then there's a bloodline aspect to it, they formulated this program this classical liberal program, and they dressed it up in this universalist language, but it's actually for them. And other peoples can vibe with that, can work out within that, but other people can't. It's not for everybody. You have to reach a certain bar of functionality. You have to have a certain moral framework, and then you have to have a certain relationship, even familial relationship. I'm sure nuclear family and the authority within the home, and that not completely deracinated, but a looser racination, a looser tie of community, Protestantism. So we've figured out how to get along with varying different beliefs, so there's a bandwidth, but it still has to work within a certain framework. And we get all this flexibility. We call it freedom as though it's infinitely free, but it's not completely free. It's ordered within this very flexible bandwidth, but it is all working out within a Christian framework. And people who adopt the Christian framework, or who can jive with it, like the Jews or the Jewish folk have.
The Judeo-Christian framework, let's say.
The Judeo-Christian framework. The Christian framework is a European framework that was evolved with a bunch of different kinds of peoples over a vast territory. The Judeo framework was evolved within a very tight ethnic group from a different part, and then migrated and worked within the Christian framework. So I don't know how to square the Judeo-Christian framework completely. That sounds like a universalizing, totalizing.
Well, I think that's what I mean. I think that if you look at the founding documents that I've been referencing, it's not universalizing, it's particularizing, but it's particularizing to a particular people in a particular moment. And that moment was not only Christian, right? Like if you think about like deists.
Yeah, what are a deist? What is a deist? It sounds like a radical centrist.
Yeah, basically. A deist is someone, I'll give the most flexible definition and the one that most people follow. Like someone like myself, I believe in God, but I don't believe that I have been provided with sufficient proof that any particular claim of revelation or miracle is trustworthy. So that means I can't rely on scripture because I don't know that it's true because someone wrote it. I have no basis for evaluating that.
How do you know that the God part's true then?
I know, well, there's a lot of reasons for that. Like most people, personal experience is, you can't translate that easily, but personal experience is a huge part of it. You can tell the story. And then also, I think the logical arguments in favor of the existence for God are better than their counter arguments. So it just
better
also
how they feel better. Or
you froze a little bit.
Feel better how? Or no.
I think they work. I think if you look at some of the arguments for the existence of God in their totality, and then you look at the world and you say like, well, if we didn't have God, what would you expect? How would it turn out? It seems more likely than not that God exists. So I think there's a logical argument for the existence of God, as well as my own, idiosyncratic experiences.
Yeah.
I'm getting you freezing on my end. I'm not sure if that's
happening on
your end.
Yeah, I think it is my end. It looks like it's a little better, but am I still glitching?
It's significantly improved.
Okay. Yeah, there's a burp in my thing.
Just backing up, deists, basically like what I would call myself.
They're the ANCAPs of the theological realm.
They believe in God. They believe in natural law, but they're pretty much agnostic beyond that.
Yeah.
Deists in the era of like Thomas Jefferson tended to think that God created the universe and like wound up the clock and then just let it run hands off from that point on. Okay. Right. It was just a starting point. But if you think about someone like Thomas Jefferson, who famously, he took his Bible and he with knife or scissors removed every reference to Jesus's divinity. Right. So the Jeffersonian Bible, Jesus is just a moral teacher with no supernatural connection to God. But he and people who believed what he believed, Ben Franklin believed what he believed, for example, Thomas Paine believed what he believed. They were included in the moral compact at the founding. They needed to find something that not was just Christian, but fit these guys too, right? Yeah. And their beliefs, natural law, a creator, are represented. Christians are also represented in the Declaration of Independence because they believe those things. They believe those things plus a bunch more specific things, but they believe those things. And to be honest with you, Jews are in there too, because natural law, the creator, this squares easily with like the Torah and Old Testament type of religious study. It doesn't, I will be candid, I am not convinced it squares easily with every philosophy out there. Like, I think there's probably a lot of philosophies that are incompatible with like core American values. And I think that we should be honest about that.
That's a very evocative image of Jefferson, one of our founding prophets in a certain respect. Cut out parts of the Bible. And it sounds like liberalism cut out a little too many things.
Modern
How do you put those? Yeah, well, no, I think that process of cutting led to modern liberalism. I think that process of cutting out things and saying, no, I'm not going to believe this part, but I like this part. I'm going to sanitize this of divinity and make this claim to morality and have divinity by way of logic, which is it's a Reddit-brained kind of thing. Deism only works for people who have a certain threshold of IQ that can think through this. It's like libertarians. Like, they're very smart guys to a fault, almost. It's like you're missing the monkey in man. Well, you're not a brain in a jar. You're not a view from nowhere. Like, these are like, and then you eventually get to a Rawlsian kind of, let's just imagine human beings can just show up here without this whole process of time, lineage, and all the pressures that are included in that, and death.
See, I actually think we might have a point of at least near agreement here. Like, I actually do think that modern liberalism has this mutation problem because they cut too deeply, right? But I think what they cut out was the natural law, the bit about the creator, all the stuff that the founders.
Okay, well, where does natural law come from?
Just to finish the thought,
are there tablets?
In my view, what our founders did, is they found what I refer to as the moral floor. They were like, Christianity has a bunch of specific claims, but this right here, this is the bare minimum you need to believe for America to make sense. And then what modern liberalism did is they said, what if we went under the bare minimum? What if we cut that last piece of the floor out? And now we're having problems. But the answer isn't that you need to go to like specifically Orthodox Christianity or something like that. The answer is that we're underneath the moral floor. There is, if you cut away at the metaphysic that supports classic liberalism, you can't be surprised when classic liberalism lacks any defense against these more virulent ideologies that are attempting to parasite it right now.
Well, sorry, I keep on interrupting you because this is a very awesome discussion.
No,
but how does liberalism get its testosterone back? How does it grow a pair?
Yeah,
and how hairy are those pairs going to end up being?
I think we have to be full-throated in this fight. Like, I think that what happens with liberalism is that liberalism became equated with we follow the law. So it's like, like a great example. Remember when President Trump was saying, I'm going to make it illegal to burn an American flag, right? And myself, all the lawyers in the world rushed out to say, hey, guys, First Amendment, you're allowed to burn your own American flag. That's the law. And we were explaining this, right? What not enough lawyers did is they didn't come out and say, First Amendment, yeah, you're protected. You can burn your own American flag, but it's a shitty thing to do. And if you do it, you're a shitty person. And that's not a question of whether the law is going to punish you. That's a question of what I think of you and your behavior because it's immoral. You should care about your country. And what I mean about that is people confuse legal liberalism as a moral system. It's not. Legalese liberalism is a question of let's protect ourselves from a tyrannical government. That's different than saying what standards should we hold ourselves to. And
well, if liberalism can't even do that, which it can't, then why? Like, what does it have to stand on? It can't protect us from the tyranny.
You know what? It's funny. It doesn't do a perfect job, but fuck, it's done look at us versus the UK right now, and say, Okay,
Well,
like whose liberalism is doing a better job defending the people from a tyrannical government? And it's not close. Like over there, you start seeing like they're like, oh, well, if free speech is just kind of this legal right, couldn't it be modified? Shouldn't we put 12,000 people arrested every year for social media posts, whatever the insane number is that they have over there? Because it loses all its teeth. And you can have, I love her, but you can have a million Helen Pluckroses yelling from the rafters that this is the wrong thing to do. But if the people don't believe it, if there's no binding philosophy that says, yes, we must put up with speech we don't like because X, because what's the reason? What's the moral ought there?
Yeah.
And I think you need a moral ought. You need a reason to believe that liberalism is worth defending and defending, with a full throat and a bold heart.
Well, bringing up UK, the difference between UK liberalism and USA liberalism, it seems to be the basic fact that we are just an entire continent. I mean, at least a huge slice of a continent, and they're a tiny island. And then they're a tiny island sandwiched between a superpower and another superpower. And then there's a bunch of other little ethnic enclaves called Europe between those two. Well, I mean, I don't know where Russia stands right now, but still. It's easier for us to be freer because we just have more space. We just basically have more space. There's more freedom to associate, to go off and, even though the government wants to enforce some sort of civil rights equalization of stripping of some freedom of association in order to implant this equitization of resources, moral worth, and race mixing or ethnic mixing by fiat, we still have tons of places to go out. You can just go to Idaho. You just go there and you'll still have to pay your taxes and stuff. And every once in a while, the feds might show up and shoot your wife in front of you, but more or less they won't do that. Whereas Britain, they have a different compact, they have a different lineage, and their moral ought is more grounded in politeness at this point than, to borrow some Yiddish, chutzpah. Right.
Well, but that's the mutation I'm talking about, right? Like, I think all the things you said are true. We have a bigger country. You can get away from people more easily. Yeah. There's more space. We're richer. We have more resources. These things are all true, indisputably true. But the other difference with us and England is that, like when I talked to Helen, who,
was this a public conversation or
it was on X.
And what does she smoke?
But I wasn't. I'm not bring her up to degrade her because I quite respect her. She's lovely. Yeah. But she was very confused at this idea that I wanted to wrap liberalism in a metaphysic. And I think, one of the things in your example, you pointed to a lot of differences between us and Europe. Another difference between us and Europe is that we're significantly more religious. And the thing about natural law is that if you're an atheist, it is hard to convince you that natural law is a real thing, a real fact of the law. It's philosophically difficult. You can do it, but it's a stretch. If you talk to someone who's religious, if they're raised Christian, even if they're raised Jewish, this is trivially true. It is, of course, true. It's foundational to their entire worldview. So the thing about religion is religion incidentally teaches you that natural law is correct. And because natural law is correct, you already bought in to the American founding philosophy. And this is why I did a debate, the left has abandoned America's moral proposition. And this is kind of what it comes down to. It's not that the right doesn't have views that are contrary to this within the broader right. They do. There's a lot of views in there, but the right is overwhelmingly religious. And, if you talk to a religious person, you say, what do you think about Thomas Aquinas when he talked about natural law? They're going to be like, yeah, probably he was dead right. And even if they haven't read him, they're going to say, I go to church and I'm taught that, we're made in the image of God and that we have certain traits that are in common with God because of that. And that's what natural law is. It's the idea that there are aspects of humanity that are unique and should be honored. And it is wrong to force someone to have a belief because they have the right to express their own beliefs. It's not wrong to influence them, which is why we have free speech. I can influence their beliefs, but I can't, at the butt of the gun, make them profess to believe what I believe.
That's right? Not Christian. Yeah, you can't.
Yeah.
I mean, no, we mock the medievals
what good
for
is it
being
praising God if you're only doing it because somebody has a knife at your throat, right? Like that. There's no moral value there.
Yeah.
And these beliefs come from somewhere, and I think we agree on that. And as we get increasingly secular, we need to think about ways of defending these beliefs. Some of it might be a resurgence of religion. Some of it might be finding people who are on the fence and saying, like, hey, instead of being an atheist, be a deist. Think about think about some natural law. You don't have to go whole hog on Christianity to believe the core philosophic requirements of the country. And that's enough. Like that's actually enough to preserve us. You don't have to be an Orthodox bro to believe this, though, of course, if you are, you already do. And I think we do have to fight that fight. We cannot get into a world where people are saying all worldviews are equally valid, all moral systems are equally valid, because there's no way to justify American values on moral relativism like that. It just doesn't make any sense.
Where do you begin then? Natural law, like so there's God and there's man.
Do you want me to do it from a religious perspective or an atheist perspective?
I'm comfortable with either.
Yeah,
because I'm not an atheist.
They're different, and unfortunately, I'm not an atheist either, so it's hard for me to do the atheist version, and I want to get better at it because I think that's actually where I could make a good sales pitch. But from the religious version, you say, all right, so we have a creator, we share some traits with our creator, and those are things that are just true about humans, about our relationship with God, about our relationship with the world. Humans want, and you see this in like 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, they automatically do it. They want to pursue their interests. They want to pursue their happiness. They want freedom, but they don't want to be unsafe. They, and there's a tension between liberty and security, right? Like if you have too much of, they cut against each other. These are things that people want. They want to be able to own property and develop it and make it theirs. These are things that humans naturally do. We want to learn. We want to explore. Something in us reaches for a higher truth that is always just outside our grasp, and we're constantly trying to find it. These are just things about people. And once you see this, you realize that we need to have a government and a culture that allows this to happen. And then there's lots of other stuff that we're less sure about, like we've been arguing about abortion for thousands of years. Like, is it 6 weeks? Is it 15 weeks? Is it 24 weeks? I don't think we have an answer to that. And when we don't have an answer to it, we should and this is the beauty of American federalism, we should let people in individual communities try things out, and then we can all learn from it. Because maybe they do the 5-week thing in a few states and it's a fucking nightmare. And then everyone says, this didn't work. Maybe the 15-week thing's better. So, it's not all armchair philosophy. We can observe. And that is kind of, I think that's what the American experiment is that our founders said, there's a few things we're sure of, not a lot, but there's a few. Those ones we're calling off limits. Don't monkey with those. And then we're going to engage in this experiment together. We're going to try to learn about the best way for humans to live. Yeah. And that's what America is. It's our attempt to do that. And that's a noble calling.
So what are the things you can't mess with? You can't mess with free speech. So no bad mouthing free speech.
I think free speech is high on that list. I think due process is incredibly high on that list.
Could you define that for me as a retard?
Due process doesn't mean that you have to have a trial necessarily. It just means that there needs to be, let's call it just proportionality between what the government is doing to you and your right to say something about it. So like if you get a parking ticket, you don't need a 8-week criminal trial to be fair. But you do need the right to show up to a judge at some point and say, he framed me. and maybe the judge figures it out, right?
Okay.
If you're trying to deport someone, they don't need an 8-week criminal trial. They just need a short hearing that says, let's prove you're here illegally, right? It could be minimal due process. On the flip side, if the government wants to put you in jail for the rest of your life for murder, yeah, you are entitled to a full criminal trial and a jury of your peers, because
proportional to the to the
we're skeptical
punishment.
of the government's use of power, and the amount of your process that you receive should be proportional to what the government is trying to do to you, right? I think that's central to the founders' vision for the country, that there has to be this just basis for the exertion of governmental power. I mean, I'm not a gun guy, but I think the Second Amendment is core. Like, I think, our founders just went through a period of intense oppression, and that oppression was achieved by limitation of arms. So the idea that, the people would be so stripped of their power to rebel against tyranny that they'd be stuck in it forever, I think that's a problem. And the Declaration says that, like, if the government ever gets too tyrannical, it's the right of the people to destroy it and replace it with a better one. And I think they were serious about that, and I think they're right. Like, you in theory could have a just king. In practice it doesn't work out, but in theory you could have a just king.
What do you mean it doesn't work out? It's worked out for millennia until we started our thing.
Oh, it very rarely works out. What you have is, in the arc of history, you have a just king and then increasingly idiot sons. Right. So and the problem with monarchy isn't that you can't have a just king. It's that when you don't have a just king, violent revolution is your only option. Right. So,
well, that's the same with liberalism. That's what they're saying. Violent revolution is our.
No, it's not. Under our system, you have the pressure release valve of voting, where, you can temper tyranny by voting for the other team. So we have a lot of safeguards before you get to the violent revolution step, which is why they value a government from the consent of the governed. Because if you have the type of government that its power comes from the people, at least in theory, the people can vote to change it. Now, there's some challenges with that. I'll be candid. Like, we have a unique issue now where, historically, it was not for the best reasons. I'm not endorsing the reasons, but historically, the voting population tended to be highly educated and small. And now the voting population is huge and has no idea what the fuck they're talking about. And as a result, our politics are getting dumber, because if you're courting the vote of people who don't know what they're talking about, there's no reason to talk in highfalutin terms, right? Like, you're gonna play WWE instead of playing philosopher. And I think that's an issue. That's a real threat to our system of government that we need to think of a solution for.
That's what I was saying. There's a freedom requires responsibility. Responsibility requires competence.
Yeah.
Are all people equally competent?
Obviously not.
Okay, what do we do with incompetence?
They have equal moral worth, but they're not equally competent. Like, let me back off legally for a moment. If I was czar of the universe, right? So,
there we go.
This is
you are even in your thought experience, you're monarchists.
Yeah, this is not actually legal. It would require constitutional amendments. But to me, I would love to see something like, in order to vote, you need to be 25 and you need to pass at least the same civics test that we require of foreigners who naturalize. Like, you have to have like at least the same minimum competency we expect of anybody else who's joining the country. Right?
Why don't we have that?
Well, but not for citizens. We have it for foreigners.
But why do we not have that for citizens?
Well, because we have a bunch of laws that say that you get the right to vote when you turn 18. Right. So, like, this would require that kind of change would require a political movement that would then create, like, a legal change.
If the Democrats can lower the voting age to 15, why can't not Democrats raise the bar? Like, why? So we're looking at entropy, right? How do you reset the bar? How do you raise the bar? How do you reintroduce intolerance to the liberal system?
Well, and I think that's the answer, is that, like, with anything, it's just about sufficient political will. Like if you have sufficient political will, you could raise the voting age. But some things are harder than others, right? Like if you need to amend the Constitution, that's a lot of political will. If you're trying to make a smaller change, it's less political will. But I think this is an important topic. It's also, by the way, I recently debated a guy called Pisco at the Word War debate in Atlantic City. Shout out, that's a really cool event. And I was arguing that the Supreme Court, which they're going to decide this year, should limit birthright citizenship, at least at the margins. And this is part of the moral justification for why is like if you come into the country and the only reason you're doing it is to take advantage of us. Like in Asia, they have these businesses where women pay a lot of money. They get a tourist visa. They come to the country. The kid's born here. They take the kid back to Asia, to China. They raise them with Chinese values. And then at any time when they can just say, hey, I'm an American now. Give me a passport. I want to vote. I want to go to school here, et cetera, et cetera.
Want to own property.
But there's nothing if you think about like my value system, what is the assurance that they believe in the American moral proposition? That they believe in our philosophy, that they accept natural law, First Amendment, free speech. There's none. They were actually raised with contrary values. So from a philosophic perspective, why on earth would you guarantee citizenship to somebody who doesn't share allegiance to your country or your values? That's insane. Now, legally, that's a more complicated story. They used to look at the Constitution, but morally, I think it's pretty obvious you shouldn't do that. It makes a mockery of citizenship. And that's what I mean about like full-throated liberalism. Like, I don't think what I just said is incompatible with liberalism. It's incompatible with kind of the modern sissy liberalism that just says, well, whatever, anything goes. But like, if you believe in these principles, you look at that and you say, God, this person doesn't believe in any of these principles. Why should I reward them gaming my system with citizenship? That's insane.
Well, practically speaking, how does the right solve the issue of its disparity or its variance, its differentness with its own self? It's more the rights have less in common with each other than the lefties do. What ties the right together is that it's not left. So how does, practically speaking, what steps need to be taken to get this liberal strong man into power?
Yeah. I think in terms of like modern politics, I think the right is at a fork in the road right now. And this is just my take, like, what do I know? But hey, I was a lifelong lefty. I think you were too, actually, if I recall correctly. I don't know if that's right.
I don't think so.
No? Okay. So I leaned very hard left most of my life and then became independent and then right-leaning after law school. It was that kind of that funny thing where you live in a bubble and you've never actually heard the principled argument from the other side. And then you go to law school and you read Scalia and you're like, wait, hold on. I think he's right. Like, what am I going to, But, and then also, this is just my own bio, but like, this was all 2016, 2020. And in that time period, as you well know from Evergreen, the left went insane. So, I was exposed to more conservative philosophy and the left went berserk at the same moment, which changed the way I viewed the world. But I think in terms of being on the left, what I saw is that the left was seduced by a false promise. They were like, oh, these communists, these like radical postmodernists, they seem like they want to vote with us. They seem like they could be a voting bloc for us. Let's court them. Like, is that really compatible with like Bill Clinton style leftism? No, not really. But they let them have a seat at the table. And I see why. It's tempting. It looks like political power. And it's very hard to draw lines accurately, right? Like, it's very hard to draw lines accurately. And I think the right is at that same moment where they're saying, like, look, there's a lot of people with a lot of ideas on the right now about what the future of the right is. And we need to start engaging in line drawing exercises and saying, like, what do we stand for? Not just what are we against? Yeah. And right now, Trump is so polarizing and popular that hasn't had to happen because he just has this magnetism to him that kind of galvanized the whole movement. But yeah, in 28, I think they will have to do that. I think there'll be questions about what is the philosophy of the right and what are its boundaries. And these questions are going to have to be answered in some kind of convincing way. And my answer is what I've given here. I think that we have a core American philosophy, and the right should be its champions. We should be the ones who are out there saying, this is who we are. This is the contours of the team. And once you see that, then the line drawing's easy. Are you saying, like, is what you're saying contrary to natural law, objective morality, the Christian framework, which is kind of subsumed within that? Yeah. I think that we could then draw those lines, but we have to agree on what the philosophy is first.
Yeah, well, that line drawing has been happening since Trump got into office. From my perspective, there was a bunch of classical liberals, left-me's, politically homeless people that ended up outside of the woke, outside of the left, and they found a big audience of people, and they got a lot of relevance, and then the woke kind of took a nap or kind of overextended itself. For some reason, landed on Biden as president, and Trump comes in and changes the tone of the government from one of censorious DEI wokery, but I mean, the DEI is still there. Did you see that coin? Did you see the coin?
No, I didn't see it.
There's I mean, I don't want to make fun of anybody for, inalienable or, just properties of being, but there's a disability activist, lesbian, queer person that's going to be on the quarter, and she's kind of obese and reaching out for a coin while she's like on the coin. So that DEI stuff is still there. It's still there, but there was a reprieve, and as soon as that reprieve happened, tons of infighting occurred on the right, and it's going along different vectors, but the most salient vector since the assassination of Charlie Kirk has been the ethnic question. And there's a lot of racists on the right, and there's a lot of, I think they have some points. I'm not going to call them good points, but they're strong points about the particularity of their people and who belongs to America. There's this trigger word called heritage American. Now that can be tightened or loosened, and there's got to be it sounds like you're okay with it to a certain degree. There's a certain degree of a heritage American. Probably how many generations you've been here, probably, or how many values. I know it's a generational thing plus some sort of values, right? But those lines are being drawn. No, there are those lines drawing. So I'm wondering how you would draw the lines.
I think that the heritage American movement is a misdiagnosis, but not one that I see why they're doing it, if that makes sense, right? Like if you think about like the way I've framed this, there's an American philosophy, and the question is whether or not you actually are on board with that, right? Now, you could be a first-generation immigrant, not from America, not, no ties here ethnically, and actually be on board with that. And I've seen this because, I used to, when I taught in very disadvantaged areas, and there were, some families who came over, and in my community, it was specifically Nigerian immigrants, and they just crushed it. Like their values synced up with our values, their work ethic synced up, their kids immaculately educated. In fact, the biggest problem my school had is that the parents moved up the economic ladder so fast that even though their kids had this great academic data, they would then move to richer neighborhoods because the parents were doing so well. And that's because that they're on board. They bought in right away. There's other cultures that I don't think often assimilate as well, but the question should be at the level of the individual. Is this family, is this person here to be part of the American experiment, to do what we do? Or are they incompatible? And that's actually what you should be looking at on like an immigration policy standard, is like, what are these people here and do they support our beliefs? Now, where I think that the heritage people are not totally wrong, but do miss it, is I think they're using ethnicity as a proxy for that idea. Like they're saying, by and large, people who've been here 4 or 5 generations seem to have are more likely to have our shared values, right? But there's of course people who've been here 4 or 5 generations who are fucking communists, right?
Yeah.
So like there's
well,
people
what do you
who
do
are
with
here
them in your
who
system?
don't share our values. You gotta win in the marketplace of ideas. You gotta win. You got to win. Now, that's different in the immigration context because you don't have to let people in who disagree with your country's value system. You don't have to give them citizenship.
Yeah.
But for the people who are already here, they have rights. You have to win in the marketplace of ideas. But I think people, I have sympathy when people invoke that concept because I think they have accurately diagnosed a problem, but are misdiagnosing the solution because they're grasping for the nearest proxy, which is ethnicity. Yeah. But I don't think that actually aligns well with who we are as a country. The challenge is in any movement. How I put this right? Sorry, this is a tough concept. In any movement, you're going to have, like, let's say your ideal statement of your values. And then you're going to have varying degrees of the way that's messaged to people with various degrees of insight, intellect, and buy-in, education, etc. So, it's kind of like any movement on the right always has a racist somewhere. Any movement on the left always has a communist somewhere because the messaging, it kind of devolves as you go down in the lowest common denominator.
Well, which is worse?
So, I think that I think that that's part of this also is that you need to be able to message this idea in a way that appeals to people. I think your point about deism was a good one. Like deism doesn't appeal to people who don't like philosophy. So you got to be able to message it to people who don't want to do the work. That said, the heritage American concept could also be very dangerous because it could rule out a lot of people who would be great Americans and rule in a lot of people who are terrible for the country. So, I think that I see why people use it as a proxy, but I don't think it's accurate.
Oh, man. If they stopped immigration for 12 years, just full stop, we don't need it anymore. How does that jive for you?
Probably too much. I think even if you look at Trump, who's been the most anti-immigration president of my lifetime, he hasn't taken that stance. And that's because
tech bros.
Well, tech bros. And also, in any policy, there's a lot of pain that comes with ideological purity, right? You're going to suffer for that one. Things are going to get more expensive. You're going to have life's going to get very hard for a lot of people if you do that extreme version of it. But what I do think is that if you look at American history, we have not always been, Ellis Island. Like there's time periods where we've been wide open, everyone come in. And there's time periods where we've been much more restricted and much more careful. And it does seem like the population wants that. Now, no immigration, I think that's probably too much. It sounds more like a talking point than like a in the weeds policy. Yeah. But limitations in this moment, I think, do make sense. And I think that one of the limitations I would really like to see is us being stricter about who gets to naturalize, who gets green cards, who gets birthright citizenship, so that we can start making sure that the people who are citizens here, whose kids are citizens here, are people who believe what we believe and who are in to the American experiment and want to participate in it. I don't think, giving citizenship to people who hate you is why? It's a crazy thing to do.
Who's your biggest enemy? What is your biggest enemy in the political domain right now?
Politically?
Yeah.
I think my animating fear was what the left was doing during the Biden years, in my estimation, which was they were under cover of law instituting what I consider to be deeply un-American stuff and making it now legal. And then they'd say, well, it's not contrary to American values because it's legal, right? So for example, people don't talk about this a lot, but in the Biden administration, there was an attempt to make it so that NASDAQ was going to require that any company that lists on NASDAQ had a certain amount of DEI representation on their board of directors. And the SEC was pushing this, right? That quietly went away when Trump assumed office, because of course. But like, think about like that. That's what I mean. Like, that's an invisible force. If you're not a lawyer and you don't read the Wall Street Journal, you probably never heard of this. But it would have changed how every company in the country operated overnight, right? And suddenly,
well, they've already been buying into that, anyways.
Yeah,
I mean, those articles that come out,
or the Biden defense of the affirmative action case of the Supreme Court, where they were saying like this idea of like Ibram X. Kendi style anti-racism was going to be written into the fabric of our law. That's a real problem for me, because I think what they're doing there is they're saying we're going to abandon this vision of natural rights about you as an, because what's the natural right? What's the core of it? It's this, I think, Judeo-Christian notion that you as the individual are what we are judging. We're judging you, your actions, your belief, your merits. That's the core of it. And now we're saying, no. It's we want legally to start judging you on your membership on various groups, like your ethnic group. That way leads to absolute ruin. And I think
you think that stuff will just snap back once the right's no longer dominant in the political arena?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And the reason I do is that I have yet to see any adjustment on the left. I was really waiting for it. I didn't go straight to the right. I went independent first. And I started talking publicly, social media, and I tried to explain these things to people on the left, my values, what I was looking at. And part of me, because I've been a lefty for so long, expected them to go, oh my God, that's a good point. Like, oh, thank God someone told us we're going to course correct. Yeah. That's not the reaction. The reaction was, of course, this is what we're doing, but let's talk about how bad Trump is, because everything is about how bad Trump is, so they don't have to articulate that the second they get back in power, they want to do the exact same thing, and they're not even willing to disavow it now. There's no lessons learned. If you watch the DNC when they were nominating people, it was the exact same DEI, identity politic, woke bullshit that cost them the election. And they're still doing it. They're just hoping that people hate Trump so much that they can get away with it. And I think that is a real concern. Like, that cannot be allowed. It is fundamentally un-American.
Are you not a leftist?
No, not at all. I was kind of like
how do we know for sure?
Well, if you need proof, I would say the fact that I speak publicly and have argued. Let's see, what am I most famous for? Arguing that it was correct to give President Trump immunity, arguing that we should limit birthright citizenship, arguing that the Supreme Court is correct to be originalist, that Amy Coney Barrett, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, these are monumental and correct additions to the Supreme Court, and that Justice Jackson, for example, has been an absolute disaster. I think that there was, if you look back in time, if we went back to 1990, I might have been on the Democratic side if that was the issues of the day. But on today's political spectrum, I don't think it's even a close call. I think my values align closer to somebody who's like conservative libertarian than they do to the modern left. And that I'll be honest, that does fill me with some sadness. Like, I wish the left was closer to what I think is like objectively reasonable, but I don't think they're anywhere close to that today.
Well, what makes the left, if you disregard the irrational and toxic aspects of it, what makes it correct?
I think that when I was growing up in the 90s, right? Like, think about when I was coming of age. Like Eminem puts out a song. Who was trying to censor him? It wasn't the left. It was the religious right. That's too. You can't say that on TV. That was in that era. The censorship came from the right. In that era, the kind of anti-free speech values, the anti-classic liberal values, were often right-leaning. But times change. times change. Like, at the I think Thomas Sowell like put I'm going to paraphrase him. I don't think I have it right, but he basically said like, if you espoused the same value that like all men are created equal and should be judged on their merit, you would be on the side of the civil rights movement in the 60s and you would be a racist today. Right? Like the goalpost just shifted. And the left, I do think, drunk deeply of this idea of cultural relativism, moral anti-realism. It's all a cultural construct, right? And as a result, now they play with definitions rather than with justice. Like they want to tinker with the definition of racism instead of actually treating people as individuals.
I think cultural relativism. I think the relativism was just a cover. I think they're realists. They're pragmatics. Pragmaticists. They want power. Yeah. And so that the relativism is good when you're trying to get power, and objectivity or certainty, let's say, rather than objectivity, is good when it serves you getting into power. I think that that's what unifies them. This is power, is getting power, and is distributing power to their friends. And I don't think that the right has the stomach for that, or at least not the Con Inc., I guess it's called, the more popular right doesn't have the stomach for real power. I don't know how we get to a place where right-leaning power is not associated with fascism. Any sort of particularism is now associated with fascism. It's morally repugnant, and it's low class. It's impolite in the very least. Getting back to where some of that is necessary, where particularism is just honestly accepted, it's a really fraught endeavor, because you are going to have to answer some really tough questions about the universality that liberalism has used to promulgate itself. And that the left is captured.
Well, I think that, the left is fond of claiming the moral high ground. But if you look at what, like I remember, I keep bringing him up, but you remember when Ibram X. Kendi was all the rage? I know he's fallen from grace now, but like 2020, 2022, he was the guy. Yeah. He won the MacArthur Genius Grant, right? And he seriously proposed that there should be an agency in the federal government that would look to see if there was any discrepancy on any metric between any diversity group, and if there was more than a 5% discrepancy, would be empowered to correct the entire economy and industry of the country in order to align with that goal. That's insane. That's a crazy thing to say.
Yeah, but why did he get to power?
Yeah, and I think that on the left, there's this, I think people call it like the post-war consensus. It's a false moral framework where they're like, we actually don't have a common moral framework. We want power. And we have a bunch of atheists and a bunch of nihilists and a bunch of moral anti-realists. They don't actually believe the same thing. And you see this because their movements constantly cannibalize themselves. But there's a few things that we've all historically aligned on as like moral buzzwords: racism, fascism. Now, we don't actually know what those things are, and we're willing to redefine them if it's useful at any point. But that's, I think, how the moral framework works. So they say, well, what he's doing is morally virtuous because it's anti-racist. And anti-racist means anything that's opposed to racism. We know racism is bad. So, of course, what he's doing is good. Instead of asking the question, well, is he respecting individual liberty? Is what he's proposing consistent with American philosophy? And it's obviously not. It's a joke. It's race communism. There's no other way to there's no other way to describe that proposal from him. So it should obviously be rejected by anybody who takes American values seriously, but it wasn't. And I think it wasn't because the left has this kind of superficial moral framework that they have perched themselves on, and it can't be trusted.
Well, but the right, or if we go back to the 90s, who is being, if the litmus test for your political ideology is who's censoring more, and not why would they be censoring? The left censors for a different reason than the conservative right censored. When the right had enough buy-in, or the conservative portion had enough buy-in to exert its will on public discourse. What did it want to censor? It wanted to censor morally deleterious product. It wanted to cap things that would erode family, would erode the sacredness of the sexual act. The left does it. There was that funny little joke where a stand-up bit that a guy did where he read what they were trying to censor with the "Baby, It's Cold Outside." It was the same time when I think it's Wet Ass Pussy or WAP was all the rage, and that was not censored. And if you read those two lyrics, they're both about sex, I guess, but there was completely different moral frameworks that were pushing one thing and not pushing. Why the cool thing or the old timey suggestive song was being put off the airwaves, and why that other thing was being promulgated by the airwaves. Like this rapid moral deterioration was what the right was wanting to censor. The conservative right was going to censor. So censorship itself isn't necessarily, I guess it's anti-liberal, but it's pro-civilization. I mean, liberalism isn't an end in itself. Civilization is an end in itself. A liberal civilization needs to operate within the framework of a civil society in order for it to flourish. But a liberal framework, copy and paste it over to a non-moral society, is going to rapidly increase its moral degradation.
No, I actually agree with you about that. I think that there's a I might not have agreed with the particular censorship of Eminem, for example, but I think the way I view it today is like the fight I'm most interested in is not left v right. I don't think that's actually the right axis. I think it's team civilization versus team chaos.
Yeah,
and the hallmark of team chaos is that when I harp on subjectivity and cultural relativism, and we get to invent what's true. That's the hallmark of team chaos. Because once you get to this worldview where there is no objective truth, there is no standard against which my actions can be judged, then the highest value is your personal politics. There's nothing higher than that. And once you get there, that's self-worship. You're saying that my own personal views are the highest possible good. And that's incredibly dangerous, because at least you might disagree with a particular religion, but at least within a religious framework, the people have to say, my wants and desires are secondary compared to what God wants of me. And I should judge my wants and desires against this standard that is more important than me. And that humility is, to me, that's the seam that we stitch together to make civilization. That we believe that there's something more important than what we want, right? And if you don't believe that, I don't know how you can build a society. And I do think the left's playing with fire when they've been, for political reasons, catering to the crowd that worships the self. Because I don't think there's any good end goal there. I think that inevitably devolves into absolute chaos if you let it.
Yeah, I keep on returning to that image of Jefferson cutting out parts of the Bible, and that he's already participating in self-worship. He has the power to edit this text. How does a deist restrain the Luciferian Faustian drive for self-worship? Well, because you're already outside of a flock. You're already outside of an authority that would correct you, an external authority that would correct you.
Well, let me put it another way, though. At the time of the founding, there were no Orthodox Christians here. They didn't exist. They came later, right? Catholic, like, people hated the Catholics back then. There was huge. Our founders, back in the Mayflower days, fled religious persecution that was Christian on Christian persecution. My family's Irish. The Troubles in Ireland, well documented. Even within a religion, you're going to have serious doctrinal differences about what's true and what's noble. And even within Christianity, those differences have been worth killing over in the past, right? What someone like Jefferson did, what the deists did, is they said, what is the irreducible floor? What is the absolute minimum that we can that we
But
must expect of you?
What are they standing on if they're able to decide that? They're already standing on some sort of self. They're already like adopting a view from nowhere. I can change the Bible. I can change the DNA of my civilization by reducing it to what I consider to be the irreducible aspects of it. And embarking on that is where the left ends up. So I don't know. I don't know how you get back from that process. Once you start snipping things, once those things go against the on that door that Martin Luther did. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're already participating in that dissolution.
So then, do we have to get rid of the Universalist Christians? Do we have to get rid of the Protestants?
I don't know a solution, but it's all apart. I don't see how the difference between the left and what the deists were doing
is that they're looking. And again, I reject the idea that this is a relativistic inquiry, because I actually do believe that natural law exists. It's real. And what they were looking at is, what is it that we need of you, right? Like, if you're going to believe in this American philosophy, what is the common core foundation? And they didn't have to look very hard, because Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, these were all deists. They didn't believe in the Christian Bible, but they still believed in the American philosophy. And you could look at that historically and say, oh, well, if you believe in God, if you believe in natural law, if you believe we have these inalienable rights, you can endorse the project we're building. You're part of the team. You have the DNA, right? Yeah. But if you reject those things, then you're not. And that was the compact. Let's call it the admixture between Christians and deists that founded our philosophy. Right? That's who we are. That's where we came from. That's why when the Orthodox came, they weren't. We didn't have, well, you're Orthodox, so you have to exclude you because we didn't have any Orthodox here before, and you have this entirely different religious structure. Because all the denominations of Christianity fall well within that kind of like moral floor. And I think that is the correct metric to look at, because not every philosophy does. Like, I don't know, I am not deeply versed in Islam, but it does seem to me fairly obvious that like the kind of like the Islamists, the actual like jihadist Islamist version of that faith is obviously contrary to American principles. I don't think it requires much analysis to figure that out. I don't think every philosophy does meet that standard, but some do. Some do. And I think that that's the inquiry we should be engaged in, is figuring out where those lines are and then defending them with a full throat.
I really appreciate this conversation. We're tugging at the seams of liberalism, the tension, not the contradictions, but the tensions within it. And I still perceive that it can only happen within a certain context, a historical context, a context of lineage. And certain people can adopt that and flourish and benefit the system and benefit from the system that liberalism has, but it has a replication crisis. It's weak in certain ways that are beneficial for people, but also beneficial to its enemies. It's weak in ways that are very beneficial to its enemies. And how to constrict, how to reintroduce intolerance into the tolerant conservative consensus is the leading issue of this conversation. And there are places where you get in trouble if you go too far, but just looking at those things is important to look at. But you're well within the purview of acceptable discourse, even if the left would call you a Nazi.
Well, I think that you actually really hit the nail on the head there in a very important respect, which is one of the things that conservatives have failed at for a variety of reasons, is that they have been driven out of / abandoned the educational institutions. Now, some of them have been so thoroughly corrupted that they're probably not worth saving, but there does need to be a revitalization of the way we teach our children and our young people. And it cannot be the case that it excludes the entirety of conservative thought from the staff, of the people who teach our kids. And that's a very tough thing to do. I mean, you were at Evergreen, so you've seen this. I don't need to explain this to you, what the dangers are here. but as a former teacher, I think that this is a real endeavor. Like I liked, I don't know if you know Jonathan Haidt, but he talked a great deal about universities that their purpose, their telos, is to find the truth versus social justice. Mm-hmm. And even if we just had metrics for that, where we're like, you're looking at somebody's resume and you're like, oh, you went to social justice, you went to truth seeking, who am I hiring? Right? Even stuff like that, like market solutions, where we can start saying, if you're the product of this educational system that prioritizes activism and self-worship over truth, I'm not really that interested in hiring you. Like, I think that you're not aligning with my goals. Even that would help conservatives retake these mm-hmm. institutions, because now all of a sudden there's market pressure. Like, oh, you went to University of Chicago? Great. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You went to social justice? Maybe not.
Mm-hmm. So I guess we're on your show right now, but my show is it's recorded, and so I'll publish it later. But so far as my show is concerned, where are people going to find your work? Where are they going to find when they get there?
Hey, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm Ryan Mullally. You can find me, same name you probably see on screen, Ryan C. Mullally on X and YouTube. I have a tiny but growing following, and I would appreciate any of you dropping by and dropping me a sub, see what I have to say. And also, just thank you, man. I really, you hit the 100K mark recently, which is a huge accomplishment.
That was fun.
And I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I guess, what do you do for your show? Are you going to stay online?
Yeah, I'm going to stay online for a bit, just so I can shout out the people who donated during the show. I wasn't going to interrupt the conversation to do it. And if you want to hear me talk about American philosophy or the Supreme Court, law, politics, come on by. Or just see me demolish Pisco in another debate. Always fun.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot for joining me and for having me on, Ryan. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time.
Cheers.
Cheers.